Chapter 1. Birth in the Steppe, in the year 1336. In the harsh windswept plains near the town of Kesh, not far from the glittering oasis of Samarkand, a boy was born who would one day make the earth itself tremble. His name was Timur, though the world would know him by another crueler title, Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane. The name came from his crippled leg, injured in youth by an arrow or sword that left him with a limp. Yet that lameness, far from weakening him, became part of his legend, a sign that no physical wound could dim his hunger for conquest. His people were Turkic-Mongol nomads, descendants of the vast armies that once followed Genghis Khan across Asia. Timur's clan was neither the most powerful nor the most prestigious. Yet from the beginning, he learned that survival on the steppe belonged not to the mighty alone, but to the ruthless, the cunning, and the merciless. The boy grew into a wiry warrior, scarred and hardened, his eyes burning with ambition that reached far beyond the horizon of his tribe's grazing lands. The steppe offered little comfort. Wolves prowled the night, sandstorms swallowed camps, and rival clans fought endlessly for water, pasture, and honor. In this unforgiving world, Timur discovered that cruelty was not simply a weapon, but a necessity. To show weakness was to invite death. To show mercy was to invite betrayal. The boy who limped among his companions vowed that one day the world itself would limp beneath his feet. Chapter 2. The young warrior. As a youth, Timur sharpened his skill in raids. He learned to ride with terrifying swiftness, to shoot arrows from horseback with deadly precision, and to vanish into the plains like a shadow. But he also learned that violence was not enough. Trickery, betrayal, and ruthless opportunism were equally powerful tools. He grew adept at striking alliances only to break them when the time was ripe. In his early campaigns, he carved his reputation with blood. Captured enemies were not simply slain. They were displayed as lessons. Villages that resisted were set aflame, their populations slaughtered, their survivors enslaved. Timur had studied the legends of Genghis Khan, and he understood that terror was a weapon sharper than any blade. To defeat an enemy on the battlefield was one thing. To annihilate them so completely that no one dared resist again was mastery. It was during one of these early clashes that Timur received the wound that crippled his leg. An arrow pierced his thigh, leaving him permanently maimed. To his enemies, this might have seemed like a fatal weakness. To Timur, it was a brand of destiny. His limp became part of his identity, a visible reminder that he was chosen to endure, to overcome, to rise above mere flesh. From then on, they called him Timur the Lame, a name that would echo through history in fear. Chapter 3. Claim to Genghis Khan's legacy. By the age of 30, Timur had already begun weaving the fabric of the empire. He understood that raw power was not enough to rule. He needed legitimacy, a banner under which to claim the loyalty of nomads and princes alike. And so he reached for the greatest legacy of all. The shadow of Genghis Khan, Timur could not claim direct descent from the great Khan, but he married into the Chagatai line, the dynasty that traced its blood to the conqueror's second son. Through this marriage, he styled himself not merely a warlord, but a restorer of the Mongol Empire. In every campaign, he declared himself the heir to the Khan's vision. Chosen by the heavens to unite the world under a single Ayur rule, this cloak of legitimacy gave him power, but it was his cruelty that cemented it. When rival clans resisted his claim, he annihilated them without hesitation. Leaders were flayed alive, their skins stuffed with straw and hung upon gates. Entire families were extinguished, so no spark of rebellion could survive. Timur began to carve his empire upon bones, and he was not ashamed. He boasted of it. He saw slaughter as not merely useful, but glorious, ordained by fate. Chapter 4. The Road to Power. By the 1360s, Timur had seized Samarkand, making it his capital and jewel. From this city, whose blue domes would one day gleam as symbols of culture and art, he launched campaigns that brought ruin to the far corners of Asia. Samarkand became both a beacon and a butcher's block. Architects and scholars were brought there in chains, forced to build monuments while the blood of their countrymen dried in the dust. His early conquests in Central Asia were marked by relentless purges. Towns that resisted his armies were erased. In Balkh, he massacred thousands. In Khwarazm, entire populations were slaughtered. He developed a signature tactic, the Pyramid of Skulls. After a battle, his men gathered the heads of the slain and stacked them into towering mounds. These grotesque monuments served two purposes. They terrified surviving enemies, and they pleased Timur, who delighted in the spectacle of submission. His reputation spread like fire across the steppe. Merchants whispered his name in fear. Rival princes trembled at his approach. Mothers in distant cities hushed their children by invoking him. "Be silent, or Timur will come for you." Already, he had become less a man than a nightmare. And the nightmare had only begun. Chapter 5. The Persian Campaigns. By the late 1370s, Timur's power in Central Asia was secure. His enemies lay dead, his rivals purged, and his capital Samarkand began to rise in stolen splendor. Now his gaze turned south, to the lands of Persia. The wealth of its markets, the beauty of its cities, the poetry of its gardens, all beckoned him. But what beckoned most was the chance to annihilate those who dared to resist his will. Persia had seen conquerors before, but few came with Timur's doctrine of terror. His first great target was Isfahan. When he marched upon it, the city at first submitted. Delegates brought him keys, tribute, and oaths of loyalty. Timur stationed a garrison within its walls. But soon resentment boiled. The people rose in revolt, slaughtering hundreds of his soldiers. The news struck Timur like a blade to the heart. In his eyes, rebellion was not just defiance. It was blasphemy. To resist Timur was to resist heaven itself. The retribution was swift and catastrophic. Timur ordered a massacre. His soldiers fanned through the streets, moving with mechanical cruelty. Families were dragged from their homes and executed in courtyards. Men were hacked apart, women violated and then murdered, children cut down without hesitation. The city became a killing ground. Eyewitnesses recorded that the gutters overflowed with blood, the stench of rot filling the air for weeks. Chroniclers claimed 70,000 died, though some whisper the number was closer to 100,000. When the slaughter was finished, Timur was not content with corpses. He demanded spectacle. The heads of the dead were gathered, stripped of flesh, and stacked into pyramids. Dozens of these macabre towers rose outside Isfahan's gates, some taller than a man. Travelers who came later described them in horror, gleaming white in the sun, silent and obscene, monuments of bones that mocked the living. From Isfahan, Timur marched to Shiraz. Unlike Isfahan, Shiraz surrendered quickly. The poet Hafez was said to have lived there at the time, spared by Timur's appreciation of verse. But the city's obedience did not shield it forever. A rumor of disloyalty was enough to trigger the conqueror's wrath. Executions followed, nobles strangled, merchants hanged from their own stalls, women dragged into slavery. Their infants dashed against stones to ensure no bloodline survived. Herat, the jewel of Khorasan, met its doom next. Its scholars and poets had made it a beacon of Persian culture. Timur, who fancied himself both destroyer and patron, coveted it. He invited the city's leaders to parley under promises of peace. When they gathered, he arrested them and ordered their execution. His army stormed Herat, slaughtering tens of thousands. Chroniclers describe bodies lying in orchards, blood soaking into the gardens where lovers once walked. The cries of women and children echoed for days as soldiers dragged them away in chains. The most infamous of his Persian massacres came at Baghdad in 1393. The Abbasid Caliphate had long since waned, but the city remained symbolic. Timur would not leave such a jewel unscarred. Upon taking Baghdad, he ordered 90,000 people executed. The killings were systematic. Men were decapitated in rows, their heads collected like harvest grain. Women were dragged screaming to the edge of town and cut down in heaps. Children were slaughtered in pits. Then, as always, Timur commanded his signature monuments. Towers of skulls. Chroniclers counted 120 such towers around Baghdad, each constructed from thousands of heads. The city became a necropolis, a palace of death. Survivors stumbled through ruined streets where vultures fed on the unburied. The Tigris carried corpses downstream for weeks. Persia bled dry. Cities that had stood for centuries lay in ruins. The land's poets and scholars were either dead or enslaved in Samarkand. The wealth of Persia filled Timur's coffers, but the cost was apocalyptic. By the time he was finished, the bones of Persia formed the very foundation of his empire. Chapter 6. The Russian Expeditions. While Persia smoldered, the north beckoned. The Golden Horde, descendants of Genghis Khan's empire, still ruled the steppes of Russia. Timur first allied with its Khan, Toktamish, but their friendship curdled into rivalry. Two predators cannot share the same plane. Their war was titanic. In the early battles, Timur's cavalry clashed with Toktamish's hordes in fields so vast that the dust darkened the sky. A slaughter was immense. After the Battle of the Kondursha River in 1391, the plains were carpeted with corpses. Wolves and ravens gorged themselves until they could no longer move. Survivors described the smell of death carrying for miles, lingering for weeks, but the climax came in 1395. At the Terek River, Timur's forces annihilated Toktamish. The Khan fled, his power broken. Timur's victory shattered the Golden Horde, ending its supremacy over Russia. The aftermath was catastrophic for the Russian lands. Timur's soldiers swarmed into Ryazan and advanced toward Moscow. Villages were torched. Churches were stripped of their icons. Priests butchered at their altars. Chroniclers describe mothers clutching infants as they were cut down, their blood staining the snow. Entire towns were left as smoldering ruins. Even when Timur did not strike directly, fear paralyzed. Chronicles in Moscow recorded his approach like an apocalyptic storm. Though Timur turned back before reaching the city, the terror of his advance haunted Russian memory for centuries. His skull pyramids even rose in the frozen north, grotesque white mounds gleaming under frost. The wolves of the steppe fed well on his passing. The destruction of the Golden Horde was a turning point in history. But for the people of Russia, it was remembered less as liberation than as devastation. Timur's war left famine, plague, and ash. The steppe itself seemed cursed in his wake. Chapter 7, the darkest history of all, the Indian invasion. By the closing years of the 14th century, Timur had drenched Central Asia, Persia, and the Russian steppes in blood. Yet his hunger was not satisfied. His gaze turned further south, across the Indus River to the rich plains of Hindustan. India was a land of splendor, its bazaars filled with silks and spices, its temples adorned with gold, its cities teeming with merchants and scholars. The jewel of all was Delhi, the capital of the Sultanate, a city of nearly 1 million souls. Timur coveted its riches, but more than that, he sought another monument of fear. The campaign began in the autumn of 1398. His army, swollen with veterans of Persia and the steppe, numbering perhaps 90,000 hardened horsemen, crossed the Indus in a thunder of hooves. Alongside them lumbered elephants captured in earlier raids, armored and terrifying, beasts of war that would spread panic among Indian ranks. They were not a mere army, but a moving tempest, a storm of iron and fire that consumed everything in its path. Villages fell first. Timur's men moved with ruthless efficiency, descending upon settlements like wolves. Temples were smashed, idols shattered with axes, sacred texts torn and burned. Priests were cut down at their altars, their blood staining the stones they had once blessed. Farmers were hacked apart in their fields, women violated in front of their families, children slaughtered to amuse soldiers who tested their blades on tender flesh. Some captives were impaled on stakes, left writhing under the scorching sun, their screams carried on the wind to terrify survivors. Others were burned alive inside their homes as torches set roofs aflame. The march south became a procession of terror. Town after town was emptied. Whole populations were enslaved, chained together, and forced to stagger behind Timur's columns. Chroniclers speak of lines of captives stretching for miles, their eyes hollow, their feet bleeding, their sobs drowned out by the laughter of their captors. Those too weak to march were beheaded on the roadside. The earth drank deeply of blood, and vultures trailed the army like faithful companions. By the time Timur reached the outskirts of Delhi, he had gathered 100,000 captives. These were not soldiers, but civilians, villagers, merchants, men, women, and children dragged from the ruins of northern India. It was then that Timur, ever suspicious, feared they might rise in rebellion during the coming siege. To Timur, captives were not human. They were potential threats, burdens to be disposed of. His solution was as cold and calculated as the blade of a knife. He ordered their immediate execution. What followed was one of the largest single-day massacres recorded in medieval history. Chroniclers describe it with trembling words. The captives were divided into groups, each delivered to different contingents of Timur's army. Soldiers drew their swords and began the slaughter. Men were decapitated in lines, their heads rolling into heaps. Women were strangled with ropes, their bodies tossed aside like refuse. Children were butchered before their mothers' eyes, their tiny cries silenced in rivers of blood. The killings continued for hours, until the fields were soaked and the corpses lay piled in grotesque mounds. The cries of the dying rose like a storm before fading into silence. In a single day, 100,000 lives were extinguished, their bodies left to rot in the dust dot. But Timur did not flinch. For him, this was efficiency, a military necessity. For history, it was an atrocity of apocalyptic scale. And yet, the greatest horror was still to come. On December 17, 1398, Timur's army clashed with the Sultan of Delhi, Mahmud, outside the city. The battle was brutal, but brief. The elephants of the Sultan's army panicked when Timur unleashed camels laden with burning straw, their screams sending the beasts into frenzy. The Sultan's forces broke and fled. Delhi lay open. Timur entered the city not as a conqueror, but as an executioner. His men surged into its streets like a tide of knives. They plundered with wild abandon, stripping houses, bazaars, and palaces of gold, silver, and jewels. But wealth was not enough. The people themselves became victims of a massacre that eclipsed all that had come before. Chroniclers describe Delhi transformed into a town from depths of hell. Entire quarters were set ablaze, flames devouring mosques and markets alike. Men were cut down in the streets, their blood running in rivulets between the stones. Women were dragged screaming from their homes, raped in alleys or before the eyes of their families, then murdered to leave no witness. Children were hurled into flames, their cries mingling with the roar of burning wood. The Yamuna River, flowing past the city, turned red with blood and carried corpses downstream for miles. For days, the slaughter continued. Timur's soldiers hunted survivors like animals, tearing apart hiding places, killing indiscriminately. Chroniclers recount scenes so ghastly they seem born of nightmare. Heaps of bodies blocking alleys, so high that men climbed over corpses to reach new victims. Dogs and crows gorging themselves on human flesh until they collapsed from excess. The wailing of women so constant, it was said to echo in the ears of the living for months afterward. By the time Timur finally called his men to order, Delhi was no longer a city but a corpse. Its streets were clogged with ash and bones, its houses looted and burned, its population annihilated. Chroniclers estimated that hundreds of thousands perished, perhaps the majority of the city's inhabitants. Those few who survived were left broken, their city stripped of wealth, its gardens and palaces reduced to rubble. The sack of Delhi was not merely a conquest, it was an extermination. Timur had not sought to rule India, but to plunder it, to terrify it, to leave it so devastated that no rival power could rise from its ashes. He returned to Samarkand with wagons overflowing with gold, jewels, and treasures, and with artisans dragged from the ruins to beautify his capital. Delhi was left a hollow shell, its soul destroyed, its memory scarred for centuries. The psychological impact was devastating. In India, the name of Timur became a curse, whispered in fear long after his death. Mothers frightened children with it. Be silent, or Timur will return. Chroniclers described him as a scourge of God, a butcher who had come not to conquer, but to obliterate. The destruction of Delhi weakened the Sultanate irreparably, leaving northern India vulnerable to further waves of invaders. For Timur, however, it was a triumph. He returned to Samarkand triumphant, celebrated as the man who had humbled Persia, crushed the Golden Horde, and now obliterated Delhi. In his eyes, the massacre was proof of his destiny, his right to be called the scourge of the earth. But for those who walked among Delhi's ruins, for those who saw vultures circling over a city of corpses, for those who smelled the stench of rot in the air, Timur was not a king, nor a conqueror, nor even a man. He was death itself, clothed in flesh, riding with an army that turned cities into tombs. Chapter 8. The Ottoman Showdown. By the dawn of the 15th century, Timur's empire stretched from the heart of Central Asia to the gates of India, from Persia to the frozen steppes of Russia. He had turned cities into graveyards and rivers into blood. Yet in the west, one rival loomed larger than the rest, the Ottoman Empire. Under Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt, the Ottomans had risen with terrifying speed. Conquering in both Europe and Asia, they were young, vigorous, and ambitious. Poised to become the dominant power of the Islamic world, Timur could not abide another predator on his horizon. He was nearly 70 years old, his body crippled by wounds and age, but his hunger for conquest burned fiercer than ever. The collision between these two titans was inevitable, and when it came, it would shake empires to their foundations. The rivalry began with insults. Bayezid accused Timur of arrogance, of cruelty, of masquerading as the heir of Genghis Khan when he was nothing but a butcher. Timur, in return, mocked Bayezid as a reckless upstart, calling him a poultry keeper who strutted like a cock but lacked true might. These words were not empty. They cut deep, and soon they were followed by swords. In 1402, the two armies finally faced one another on the plains near Ankara. The forces were vast. Bayezid's army numbered over 100,000, hardened by victories against crusaders in the Balkans. His janissaries, the elite infantry corps trained from childhood, were considered among the most disciplined troops in the world. Timur's host, drawn from the steppes of Central Asia, the ruins of Persia, and the fields of India, was no less formidable. His cavalry moved with the swiftness of shadows, and his elephants that were captured from India terrified men and horses alike. The summer sun beat down as the armies clashed. Bayezid, true to his nickname, hurled his troops forward with the speed of lightning. The Ottomans struck hard, their janissaries driving into Timur's lines, their cavalry charging with ferocity. For a moment, it seemed the thunderbolt might overwhelm the old conqueror, but Timur had prepared the ground. He had dug trenches to disrupt the Ottoman cavalry, luring them into traps. He had bribed and enticed many of Bayezid's vassals, particularly the Tatars and Turkmen, who betrayed the Sultan at the crucial moment. As the battle raged, whole contingents of Bayezid's army defected to Timur, turning their weapons against their former comrades. The Ottoman line faltered. Then Timur unleashed his reserves. His cavalry encircled the Ottomans like a tightening noose. Dust rose in choking clouds. The sun disappeared behind a haze of arrows. Men screamed as horses crashed into one another, as swords cut through flesh, as bodies fell in heaps. The cries of the wounded filled the air. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Bayezid fought bravely, refusing to abandon the field. Chroniclers describe him hurling himself into the fray again and again, his sword flashing, his horse foaming with sweat. But courage could not stop the collapse. His army broke. Men fled in panic, trampling one another in their desperation to escape Timur's encirclement. The ground was so thick with corpses that survivors stumbled over bodies as they ran. When the dust cleared, tens of thousands of Ottomans lay dead. The field was a carpet of blood and broken weapons. Vultures circled overhead, and wolves prowled the edges, waiting to feast when the sun set. The air stank of death. It was one of the greatest disasters in Ottoman history. And then came Bayezid's humiliation. The mighty thunderbolt, conqueror of crusaders, breaker of Balkan kingdoms, was captured alive. Chroniclers disagree on what followed. Some say Timur treated him with grudging respect, offering him food at his own table. Others, in stories repeated for centuries, claim that Timur mocked him cruelly. The most infamous tale tells of Bayezid being locked in an iron cage, dragged from city to city like an animal on display. Some accounts even suggest that Timur forced him to watch his wife serve at banquets. Dressed in humiliation, her beauty paraded before Timur's soldiers. Whether these stories are true or a legend, their endurance speaks to the depth of Bayezid's disgrace that the once mighty sultan, who had threatened Constantinople itself, was reduced to a prisoner gnawing at his shame. He died a year later in captivity, broken in body and spirit. The Ottoman Empire he had forged collapsed into chaos, torn apart by civil war as his sons fought bitterly over succession. For a generation, Ottoman expansion into Europe was halted, its momentum shattered by Timur's victory. But Timur's triumph did not end on the battlefield. In its aftermath, he unleashed his cruelty upon Anatolia. Towns that resisted were annihilated. In Smyrna, the stronghold of Christian knights, he ordered the defenders executed and the city burned. In smaller towns, every adult male was slaughtered, their heads piled into the familiar pyramids of skulls. Women were seized as spoils, dragged into slavery, their children often murdered to prevent rebellion. Chroniclers describe villages left so empty that wolves wandered through the streets. Famine followed. With crops destroyed and livestock stolen, entire provinces starved. Survivors of the massacres stumbled through ruins, hollow-eyed, their bodies wasted. Parents abandoned infants in the wilderness, unable to feed them. The once thriving lands of Anatolia were reduced to silence. Their fields sown not with wheat, but with bones. Timur took pride in the devastation. He boasted of his victory, not merely as a military triumph, but as proof of his divine mandate. In Samarkand, he celebrated with feasts and monuments, parading his prisoners and artisans through the streets. H shattered the Ottomans and left Anatolia scarred by massacre and famine. Chapter 9. The Architect of Terror. By the opening years of the 15th century, Timur was no longer just a conqueror. He had become something more terrifying, something almost elemental. His armies did not merely march. They descended like a storm of iron and fire, and wherever they passed, they left behind a silence so deep it seemed the earth itself had been emptied of life. He was not simply a man who won battles. He was the architect of terror. Terror was his policy. Terror was his strategy. Terror was his identity. Other conquerors spoke of empire, of glory, of prosperity, of religion. Timur spoke of fear. He cultivated it like a farmer cultivates grain, sowing death and harvesting submission. For him, cruelty was not random indulgence. It was a carefully designed system, a weapon sharpened with precision and wielded with delight. No image captures this better than his infamous pyramids of skulls. These grotesque monuments became the signature of his rule, his calling card, his art form. After each major battle, after each conquest, after each massacre, he commanded that the heads of the slain be gathered, stripped of flesh, and stacked into towering mounds. The size and number of these pyramids varied, but their purpose was always the same: to terrify, to humiliate, to remind survivors that resistance was futile. They were ghastly architecture, designed not to house the living, but to glorify death. Take Baghdad, for example. When Timur seized the city in 1393, he ordered the execution of nearly 90,000 people. The killing was systematic. Whole neighborhoods were marched into open fields and decapitated in rows. Soldiers competed to see how many heads they could collect, and piles of severed heads rose like obscene harvests. Chroniclers counted over 100 towers of skulls around the city. These were not crude heaps, but carefully arranged structures, mortared together with mud so they would endure. Travelers who came later described seeing them, glistening white under the sun, grotesque towers that cast long shadows across a city that had once been the heart of a caliphate. Damascus met a similar fate. Timur admired its artisans, its calligraphers, its architects, and he spared them, but only to drag them in chains to Samarkand. For the rest of the population, his judgment was merciless. Entire districts were set ablaze, their inhabitants butchered in the streets. The sound of wailing filled the air as mothers clutched children only to be cut down where they stood. The great bazaars that had once hummed with trade became slaughterhouses. When the killing was finished, the survivors were marched away, leaving Damascus a shell of its former self. Aleppo's fate was no better. When its citizens resisted, Timur unleashed his fury. Streets were filled with corpses, blood ran in the gutters, and dogs feasted openly on human flesh. Chroniclers describe men impaled on stakes, their bodies swaying in the desert wind as a warning to anyone who might dream of defiance. The survivors were dragged away in chains, their city left a ruin. These massacres were not accidents of rage. They were deliberate acts of psychological warfare. Timur understood that fear could travel faster than armies. A single massacre could cause a dozen cities to surrender without a fight. A single pyramid of skulls could break the will of an entire region. His cruelty was efficient. It saved him battles by making those battles unnecessary. The word of his atrocities galloped ahead of him, spreading through merchants, refugees, and whispers in marketplaces. By the time his banners appeared on the horizon, terror had already softened the gates, and yet it would be a mistake to see his cruelty as merely pragmatic. Timur also took pleasure in it. Chroniclers write of him riding out to gaze upon the pyramids of skulls, smiling as though admiring a monument of marble. He boasted of his massacres, recording them in proclamations as though they were triumphs of engineering. To him, death itself was a form of architecture, and the skull pyramids were his masterpieces. The numbers associated with his massacres stagger the imagination. 70,000 at Isfahan, 90,000 in Baghdad, 100,000 captives executed in a single day before the sack of Delhi, tens of thousands in Aleppo, in Herat, in Damascus. Some modern historians estimate that as many as 17 million people may have perished as a direct result of his campaigns. An almost incomprehensible toll in an age when the world's population was far smaller than today. The human suffering behind those numbers defies description, but glimpses remain in chronicles. At Isfahan, Families were dragged into the streets and executed together, their heads severed and tossed into baskets. At Delhi, children were herded into pits and slaughtered in heaps, while their mothers screamed until they were cut down themselves. In Baghdad, the stench of corpses was so strong that even scavenging dogs fled the fields. Travelers passing through weeks later still gagged on the smell, and survivors described nightmares that haunted them until death. The psychological impact was enormous. Entire regions collapsed into despair. Farmers abandoned their fields, unwilling to risk planting crops that might be seized or destroyed. Cities emptied themselves at the rumor of Timur's approach, their people fleeing into mountains and deserts, where many starved to death. The mere whisper of his name could paralyze a town. His cruelty rippled outward like a shockwave, creating famine, depopulation, and chaos even in places his armies never reached. And yet, amidst this devastation, Samarkand blossomed. The artisans stolen from Damascus, Isfahan, Delhi, and countless other cities built mosques and palaces of breathtaking beauty. The contrast was obscene. While skull pyramids rotted in foreign lands, Timur strolled through gardens built by enslaved labor, admiring domes of turquoise and minarets that soared toward heaven. His cruelty was not mindless. It was directed, purposeful, and always tied to the glory of his capital. He destroyed so that he might build, but what he built was drenched in blood. Timur became a legend in his own lifetime, and that legend was inseparable from terror. To his followers, he was a man chosen by heaven, a second Genghis who united lands through divine mandate. To his enemies, he was the living embodiment of death. Both views were correct, for Timur had fused conquest and cruelty into a single philosophy. He did not simply conquer through fear. He made fear his empire. His massacres also left scars that endured long after his death. In India, the memory of the Delhi slaughter lived on for centuries, coloring perceptions of Central Asian invaders who followed. In Persia, poems and chronicles remembered him not as a patron of art, but as a butcher who had turned gardens into graveyards. In the Middle East, mothers frightened children into silence by whispering his name. In Russia, chronicles spoke of his shadow as though it were an apocalypse. His cruelty lingered like a curse, infecting memory itself. What is striking is how deliberate, how organized, and how systematic it all was. Timur was not a madman lashing out at random. He was cold, calculating, and obsessed with control. The skull pyramids were not accidents. They were planned, measured, executed with the same precision as his military campaigns. To him, terror was both science and art, and he wielded it with the same pride that others wielded, banners of faith or law by the time of his death. Timur's pyramids of skulls dotted landscapes from India to Syria, from Persia to Russia. They stood for years, silent and grim, reminders that one man had sought to build his empire not on treaties, not on alliances, not on faith, but on the bones of the slain. And though many of those towers eventually crumbled into dust, their memory did not. They lived on in chronicles, in folklore, in nightmares. Thus Timur entered history, not only as a conqueror, but as something darker. He was not content to win battles. He wanted to annihilate the will to resist. He wanted his enemies to see death not as the price of resistance, but as the inevitable consequence of existence itself. He wanted the world to believe that to defy Timur was to invite extinction And in this, he succeeded. For Timur, the architect of terror, death was not the byproduct of war. Death was the foundation upon which he built his empire. His pyramids of skulls were his palaces, his massacres his monuments, his terror his true legacy. And long after his empire fractured and his descendants faded, it was that legacy that remained, the vision of a man who made fear into a weapon so powerful that even centuries later, his name is still whispered with dread. Chapter 10. Descent into obsession. Age did not soften him. As Timur grew older, his limp worsened, his body ached, but his hunger for conquest remained insatiable. He could not stop. His empire was vast, his coffers overflowing, his capital a marvel of art and architecture. Yet he dreamed of more. Always more. In his later years, his paranoia deepened. Rivals within his court were executed on suspicion alone. Generals who hesitated were slain. He had built his empire on fear, and fear consumed even his closest allies. And still, he marched. Campaign after campaign, he drove his armies into new lands, leaving devastation behind. The corpses piled higher. The pyramids of skulls multiplied. His cruelty had long since ceased to be a means of conquest. It had become an end in itself. Timur the Lame, Timur the Conqueror, had become Timur the Executioner of Nations. Chapter 11. The March on China. In 1405, at nearly 70 years of age, Timur launched one final, colossal campaign. His target was China, the richest prize of all. He dreamed of seizing the throne of the Ming dynasty, of carving his name into the very heart of Asia. His armies, numbering hundreds of thousands, marched eastward through the snows. Villages were stripped bare, populations enslaved. The earth shook beneath the hooves of his cavalry. But Timur never reached his goal. Sunilness struck him down. The old conqueror shivered with fever, his body failing. In February of 1405, Timur the Lame finally died. He left behind a corpse, but also a legend of terror that stretched across continents. His men buried him in Samarkand, in the mausoleum of Gur-e-Amir, beneath an inscription that warned, "Whoever opens this tomb will unleash a greater scourge." Centuries later, when Soviet archaeologists opened it in 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union within days, and the world shuddered once more. Chapter 12. Legacy of Blood and Marble. Timur's legacy is written in contradiction. He slaughtered millions, leaving cities in ashes and plains littered with bones. His cruelty was unmatched, his massacres vast, his pyramids of skulls unforgettable. He was a tyrant who drank deeply of human suffering, who turned slaughter into spectacle, who made terror into architecture. And yet, in Samarkand, he built monuments of breathtaking beauty. He filled his capital with mosques, madrasas, and gardens. He patronized scholars, poets, and artisans, though many were captives dragged in chains from conquered lands. His dynasty, the Timurid line, would give birth to art, science, and empire, culminating in the Mughal dynasty that ruled India for centuries. But the shadow that clings to his name is darker. Timur was not merely a conqueror. He was one of history's greatest executioners. Chroniclers estimate his campaigns left as many as 17 million dead, a figure that chills the imagination. His name, like Vlad's, became a curse whispered in fear. A reminder that man can become not only a destroyer of armies, but a butcher of worlds. To his followers, Timur was a genius of war, a master of strategy, a restorer of empire. To his enemies, he was the scourge of God, a whirlwind of death. Both views are true. He embodied the paradox of power, brilliance and horror, splendor and ruin. His empire did not last. Within decades of his death, it fractured. But his memory endured, carved in stone, sung in poems, cursed in chronicles. He had proven that fear could rule nations, that terror could conquer continents. Yet he had also proven that cruelty, however vast, cannot outlive the man who wields it. His monuments stand still, but the skull pyramids have long since crumbled to dust. Still, when we speak his name, the echoes of screams rise from the past. Timur the Lame, Timur the Conqueror, Timur the Butcher. He lived by the sword, and he left the world drenched in blood.